Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the World Affairs Council of Atlanta for today's conversation, reporting the World Cup from Qatar to Atlanta. My name is Ricky Bevington. I am president of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. And our guest expert is Felipe Cardenas, staff writer for The Athletic and host of the COPA podcast from The Athletic. The World Affairs Council of Atlanta is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization. Our mission is to inspire Atlanta to lead globally. We are a forum for informed discussion of global affairs that impact Metro Atlanta, and we do this in support of Atlanta's transformation into an international economic hub. And we're able to do all of it thanks to individual and corporate members. You can learn more at our website, wacatlanta.org. That's wacatlanta.org. We've got a great conversation ahead with Felipe, the World Cup coming to North America in just 4 short years. We're so pleased to have this conversation talking about Felipe's experience covering this year's tournament and giving us a preview of what to expect when the World Cup arrives on Atlanta's doorstep in 2026. Felipe Cardenas, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Ricky. Thanks for having me.
Well, we also have audience Q&A, so please use your Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom. I'd like to start this conversation just taking a moment to remember respected American soccer journalist Grant Wahl, who died last week at a World Cup. He was covering the cup, the game. And just in the last 24 hours, we have learned that he actually passed away from a ruptured aortic aneurysm. Felipe, how are you and so many of Grant's colleagues in the world of sports journalism handling this shock?
Well, I'll be honest, it is certainly established like a dark cloud over the tournament. It's been difficult since Friday when his death was confirmed to just get back into the games, quite honestly. You know, I was there for 23 days. I spent a little bit of time with Grant. You know, he was more part of the US Corps. I was covering multiple teams, but I ran into him several times. He was always somebody that, as you've probably seen on social media, just a fan of everybody's work, willing to amplify people's works, other journalists as well. And so I think all of us that are part of the US soccer reporting community are still very stunned and saddened and trying to, at the same time, do our jobs and cover the biggest sporting event in the world, knowing that, you know, Grant Wahl was a big part of it. And that was his 8th World Cup. So it's going to take a while, honestly. And just speaking with colleagues, and you already mentioned the World Cup in 4 years, and there's a Women's World Cup next year as well, next summer. Not seeing him at those tournaments is going to be, you know, a stark reminder of the reality of having lost him so early.
And Grant Wahl was not only a high-profile soccer journalist. He was detained at the beginning of the World Cup at a stadium for wearing a T-shirt with a rainbow in support of gay rights. Were you, as a Western journalist, were you operating in an atmosphere of fear? Were you worried about this?
I think initially there was a fear of the unknown. You know, I'd never been to the Middle East. There's never been a Winter World Cup. There had never been a World Cup in that part of the world. There was a lot of, factual reporting about how Qatar earned the World Cup, the corruption behind that World Cup vote. There are people spending time in jail that were part of that now. So obviously, culturally, coming from the West, we knew we were going to confront big differences as far as human rights goes. I have a lot of colleagues, both in the UK and here in the US, that they are geopolitical reporters that cover the sport in that sense. And those are the reports that were coming out before the World Cup. So, and as you know, Rick, we spoke offline, the New York Times, which acquired the Athletic recently, we work with them closely now, and they prepared us reporters to go to that World Cup the same way they prepare a war reporter to go to Afghanistan or Ukraine, with the sort of concerns that we should be aware of. We were given burner phones, burner laptops. We were told not to take our personal items because we were entering what they called a surveillance state, and a state that does it very well, the Qatar state, that regime. So those were all presented to us before the World Cup, months before. So I was heading there thinking like, okay, I'm going to have to be aware of this. And of course, we knew that the rainbow imagery for gay rights was going to be an issue. It became an issue right away as soon as some teams like Germany, England, Denmark wanted to portray the rainbow flag as part of their captain's armband, for instance. And that was the first notion where we saw that FIFA didn't really, I guess, stand up for the teams. They sort of left it to the Qatari regime, and eventually there were a threat of sanctions against those teams if they went forward with that sort of message. And so when Grant was detained, we unfortunately, it wasn't surprising. It was surprising that a journalist was detained, yes, and someone that we knew very well. But I think it was the first notion of, okay, this is real, this is going to happen. And it continued. There were fans that could not enter. There was a gentleman with a watch band that was rainbow colored, and the security confiscated that. A US fan, I believe, was removed from the stadium for having a rainbow flag as part of his dress. So even though I did not see personally any case of homophobia, we knew just by checking Twitter and following international reports that it was still very much a real issue in Qatar.
Fascinating that you had intensive, almost wartime journalism training from New York Times experts. Let's bring our audience a little bit behind the scenes. You've been kind enough to share some photos, and I'm going to share my screen so that those of us who are joining us right now can see what you saw. Just to have you go, quickly through, what are we looking at here? Here's a skyline.
So yeah, I was actually staying more in central Doha, close to the National Museum of Qatar, which is not what you see here. I was not staying in a very modern, glitzy part of Doha. This is what they call West Bay, close to Corniche, which is very close to the water. And this is actually where Fox Sports had they had 3 studios. It was pretty incredible that Fox had constructed 3 studios. Their main studios were here in this walkway. This is like a promenade close to the main city center of Doha. So we were there I was there for an event. I walked this routinely just to get vibes. But this was very much different from what we're going to see next, which this is Souk Waqif, which is a 20-minute walk from where I was staying at my hotel. And what you see here is days before the World Cup started. Now, I arrived on the 13th. The tournament started on the 20th. And I went to Souk Waqif and reported from there on the fact that we were seeing a country that was not fully prepared to host a World Cup. There was still construction going on. There was a lot of confusion about like, what can tourists do? Can tourists wear shorts? Can women wear shorts? Can women show their shoulders? Like, can we drink? Is alcohol served? Is it illegal? Like, all these things were happening just a week before the tournament. And Souk Waqif quickly became the hub for fans and media. This is what you see here is just like a basic day before the tournament. Later on, as the games kicked off, like I could barely walk through the crowd of this massive open air market. And a lot of TV stations from around the world would set up here because it was great for ambiance and do their reporting from there.
Got it. Okay. And I love this, that we've got some outfits that you could buy in local dress.
Yes, this is a very typical sort of street vendor that you can see a mix of traditional. There are rugs, there are souvenirs. Not branded souvenirs. You're not going to find like FIFA branded or Adidas or anything like that here. All of the jerseys are sort of knockoff jerseys. But yeah, as you can see, there's Brazil, Argentina, and other countries, this style of just local regional dress that I saw fans wearing, which, international fans that would buy these and like sort of walk around the metro station, walk around the stadiums. I think just trying to experience the culture. I remember thinking with other reporters, like, is this okay? Is this, how should we feel about this? But again, the locals love to sell them. They were pushing them on tourists. And so this was just a basic sort of, I love Qatar souvenir. I love New York type of setup.
And a part of my desire to show these pictures is that this is what's coming to Atlanta. So,
right.
As is this is the equivalent of MARTA, and this is a lot of people trying to get on a plane. Train.
Right. So this is after USA Wales, which I was at that game, and this is the crowd leaving the stadium trying to get on the train. And so the train station, the metro rail in Qatar was brand new, and to be honest with you, it was pretty spectacular. It was sparkling brand new. It ran like a dream. It was always on time. And for journalists and fans that had what they called a Haya card, which is essentially like an identification card, which has your passport number. It tells you whether you're a ticketed fan or not. And if you had that, you could get on the metro rail for free. And so it became an easy mode of transportation for a lot of people. And it was always crowded out the stadium. Leaving the stadiums was a big issue. It became an issue, to be honest with you. There were so many people. Sometimes this crowd that you see, people would be sprinting to get to the train first. And it became a bit of a security issue in that sense. Thankfully, I did not see anyone get trampled, or no kids were getting lost or anything like that. But it was something that we consciously knew, okay, after the games are over, how are we getting back to our hotel? Do we want to get into this crowd? And in the end, once you get up those stairs that you see in the background, everything ran smoothly. But this was like 30 minutes of waiting in this crowd.
And of course, you met lots of interesting people. Tell us about him, this man, and his story.
So this is interesting because, again, like I said, this is a week before the tournament began, and we were just walking through Souk Waqif, talking to locals, talking to anyone to just get a vibe, a sense of what was coming, if they were ready. I met this man. His name is Homero. He was a Mexican national who had just spent a week in Iran. That's what he told me. He was there visiting Iran as a tourist, and then he came to Qatar to follow the Mexican national team. And the reason why he was a big part of a story that we wrote ahead of the World Cup about is Qatar prepared? What have we seen on the ground a week before the World Cup? Is that he described the country of Qatar as, and this is his quote, as an unoriginal country. And what he meant by that is that of 4 of the 5 people he would run into, 4 of the 5 were immigrants from Nepal, Bangladesh, India, the Philippines. The Philippines, for instance, I think is the 3rd most populated immigrant population in Qatar. Nepal, in India, there's large communities. And those are a lot of the workers that you saw in these small shops at the stadiums as well. And so he gave me sort of a first hand witness account of the immigration situation in Qatar, and he described it as a difficult one because a lot of them aren't given the same rights as a Qatari national. They're low paid, but they're being highly depended on during this World Cup to do a lot of the concession jobs, to keep the small businesses open, to work all hours of the night. And so other than talking about the Mexican national team, the fact that he felt that being in a Middle Eastern country like Qatar, he didn't feel the fervor of a World Cup that you would typically feel at a Latin American country, or what we'll probably feel when the World Cup comes to North America. It was just sort of like, it felt like, in his words, like a project. And I can attest that later on, it felt like I was at a convention. It was sort of strange. But then once the games really started going, the upsets started occurring, the story started rolling out, Messi started to play well, you sort of forgot about all that. But a week in, it was sort of a strange feeling to be in this very locally focused World Cup, just one city and everyone in the same place.
Well, the last time the U.S. hosted the World Cup was 1994, and as you told me offline, we didn't even have a major league. We didn't have a league. It didn't even have a league then. So the expectation is that Atlanta is going to be absolutely bananas when we're hosting, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Let's look at this last picture here, because this is a moment where you, as a journalist, kind of went off pitch, and had to. Here we go. So what are we looking at here? And then after this, we're going to get back into how the U.S. men's national team played. We're still proud of them, even though they got knocked out in the round of 16, and then really turn to what's coming to Atlanta. So what are we seeing here, Felipe?
So these are shipping containers that were remodeled, if you will, as accommodations for fans. And this was a fan zone, is what they were called. And you could go on a FIFA website, a FIFA sponsored website, and book accommodations, everything from hotels to cruise ships that were used as temporary housing for fans as well, villas, upscale, luxury Airbnb type stays as well. And then there was this, and this was modeled and branded as for the adventurous World Cup fan. And as you said, Ricky, I typically write about the sport. I'll write about the tactics and the personalities of the game and do feature interviews on coaches, players, the culture of football. And I was given this assignment by my editors to go before the World Cup started and find out what this place was like. It was a massive, sprawling, it was like a college campus full of these storage containers where fans would eventually show up. There were big screen areas to watch games, and it was all under the hot sun of Doha. No shade. There were food trucks, and there was a supermarket and all that. But when I started to report on it, there were fans from Atlanta that reached out to me via Twitter saying, "Hey, okay, now I'm concerned. I booked those shipping containers for my family now." And I spoke to them via Twitter on DM, and they gave me firsthand accounts of what that eventually was. The main hangup for them was that the check-in process took over an hour. There were other reports from other fans talking to other journalists that the water ran out on the first day. The concessions weren't always working. Obviously, the heat was a big issue, and what was dubbed as the FIFA website said, we have a fitness center, and the fitness center, and I say this politely, it did resemble like a very old like public park, and with the type of like swings and exercise equipment that you would find at a small park. Someone wrote to me and said it looks like a prison yard. I was like, oh my gosh, I guess it does. But again, I spoke to contacts of the communication arm of the Qatari regime, which is the Supreme Committee. They reiterated that housing was going to be adequate for fans traveling for the FIFA World Cup. And in the end, it appeared to be. Now, I wouldn't have stayed there, but that was an issue for the tournament. There was not enough lodging for the estimated 1.5 million fans that traveled to Qatar for the tournament. So that was a main subject throughout the tournament.
So let's take a pause here and invite our audience to use the Q&A function in the Zoom to ask Felipe questions. We have a question from Nicholas Wooliver, who asks, stand by. Great presentation. Assuming you applied for Paris 2024 Olympic media credentials, how do you think the upcoming football tournament in France will compare to Qatar in terms of reporting ease?
Interesting question. Actually, Nicholas, I have not applied for Paris 2024. I don't know if I'll be covering that tournament. It would be great to cover an Olympic tournament. And speaking of the Olympics, I think what's interesting is that a lot of my colleagues that have covered Olympic Games that were in Qatar with me described the environment and the feel of the tournament in one localized city as very Olympic-esque. And the fact that the main media center and the International Broadcast Center was centrally located. It was the Qatar National Convention Center that they remodeled for us journalists. It was the size of an airport, to be honest with you. It was incredible. And everything was there. The match day -1 press conferences. So every time the day before a team played, they would have their main press conferences at the main media center. And that for people that have covered the Olympic Games have said, well, this is great. We can go to one location, get all the press conferences that we need, just like the Olympic Games. So I think in that sense, anyone that goes to Paris in 2 years that covered this World Cup will remember the convenience of that, the convenience for journalists to know this, I'm going to one place. I don't have to get on a plane and travel to another city to cover a team. As far as the sporting part goes and any of the organization for Paris 2024, I think honestly people will remember this past summer's Champions League final that was in Paris, that there were a lot of ticketing issues for fans. And there was a big controversy about fans not being able to get into the game on time. Paris and just their organization was heavily criticized for that. So now you're inviting the world And again, the Olympic soccer tournament is not the World Cup, but it will be heavily viewed. And I'm expecting Paris to have those things figured out by the time the Olympic Games come around.
And I know Atlanta, all of the wonderful people in Atlanta who are leading our bid for as many games as we can get are paying attention and learning those lessons from other cities. Let's just talk about the U.S. men's national team. What was the buzz among reporters in Doha about how our team was playing and what our future looks like?
Good question, because there were two different sides of that. If you were a reporter that has been covering the U.S. men's national team for years or throughout this cycle, then I think there was disappointment that the team folded the way they did against the Netherlands in that round of 16 game. There's a lot of expectation that this team could perhaps get to a quarterfinal. I thought that was a little bit ambitious considering the age of the team, and only a few players had World Cup experience. They were the second youngest team at the World Cup, just behind Ghana. And it was, even though it was a manageable draw and they were an undefeated team entering the second round, the way they went out I think the narrative here in the United States is, okay, was that good enough? Is the manager the guy to take this team to 2026, a young team that has a lot of promise? Internationally, I felt what was interesting is that there was, I think there was a level of the first impression from a lot of media members that had never seen the U.S. or didn't cover them is that this was a team that played pretty good soccer, that could attack some more established teams. They played very well against England, could have won that game, and they were outclassed against the Netherlands. But they had a style, and as you know, Ricky, that is very. Fans, pundits, and journalists love to jump on that. Does a team have a defined style? And I think you started to see something sort of becoming part of a style for the American team. Internationally, I would be told they play well, and I think that at a World Cup is a big compliment, honestly.
To play well. Well, I have all the hopes for 2026. I think we'll be ready to score some goals.
They have to score, right? They have to
4
score
years.
goals. Yeah.
Somebody has got to emerge as like the scorer.
And
just
there
one
will
of
be
us.
pressure. There will be that pressure, Ricky, as you mentioned. This is a host country. The United States, that by 2026, this team that we saw should be considered. I mean, it's going to be semifinal or bust, I think, for the United States, and they've never reached the semifinal. So we will see if that's also too ambitious of a prediction. But when you're hosting the World Cup, that's what comes with it. That's the pressure that comes with it.
Well, everything I saw from the U.S. men's national team gave me great potential, and then a couple more years to mature and develop, and I'm feeling really good about it. So let's pause before we take another question. Let's take another question, and then we're going to pivot to Atlanta and talk about what's coming, what we can expect. We have a question from Forrest Clinard, who asks, what was the inside of the container housing? Do you know what it looked like?
Yes, I did. Yeah. So I was there, and you mentioned at the top of the webinar, was there any fear as far as the reporting that I did? And I remember that day, the tournament had not started, so I was going to this fan zone unannounced. I had not set anything up with any sort of contacts or sources, and I was expecting to be told, you can't film here, you can't record that. I was just not detected, honestly. There were still workers there setting up the rooms, setting up the amenities. And so when I was able to speak to some of the workers they were foreign workers, they weren't Qatar nationals, I would ask them, are the rooms ready? And they said yes. And I just sort of snuck into a room and took a picture, and I saw two small beds. I mean, it was like the size of a small dorm room. There were two I don't even know what, not definitely maybe full-size beds for an adult, a small refrigerator. I was told that they were air conditioned, and then that was confirmed through a fan from Atlanta that stayed there. There's a bathroom and a sink. Tight quarters, but you have what you need. The bare essentials are there.
It's a shipping container, so
Right,
it's not a hotel room. So when the World Cup comes to Atlanta, to give our audience some context, background, in 2026, there will be a lot more teams. The tournament is expanding from 32 teams to 48 teams. This is the first time that the World Cup has been held regionally across multiple nations. This is a North American World Cup. So 11 matches will be in the US, 3 will be in Mexico, 2 will be in Canada. FIFA has not yet announced which matches will be played in which city. So here's Atlanta's bid. Atlanta is vying for the final, as well as the tournament's media center. I'd also love to hear if you know, Felipe, if we're trying to get anything more. And the Atlanta Convention and Visitors Bureau estimates that each match that Atlanta hosts would generate $4.6 million worth of global media exposure. And we do have a question about soft sports diplomacy. So we're going to talk about what global media exposure really means. So that's kind of the context that Atlanta is looking toward. Felipe, from now that you've covered the games in Qatar, what are you expecting for Atlanta?
I'm expecting a city like Atlanta that has so many resources to really invest in hosting and being a host city. I expect it to be probably one of the top host cities in that World Cup. And why do I say that? Well, because just demographically, I've been here 12 years. I'm not originally from Atlanta, but I've been here 12 years now. I understand the demographics of this city, the growing demographics, the young demographics, the diversity here in Atlanta, the fact that there's a hunger and a craving for the sport. We've seen that with the success of Atlanta United. They have a world-class facility in the Mercedes-Benz Stadium. And this is a city that has hosted international tournaments before. This is not going to be new for Atlanta. It was very new for Doha. It won't be the case for Atlanta. And just since in having been at the event when they announced the host cities and seeing the committee here in Atlanta, the excitement that they had, the commitment that they have to making sure that their bid process was not only a winning bid, but I felt like they really were ambitious in thinking, we still have more to achieve. And so, yes, there are other cities like Los Angeles and Dallas that are vying for the final. That is, billions of people watch that game. It's a massive moment for any city in any stadium. But my sense in speaking to people that are closer to the committee is that Atlanta's going to go for it. They're going to go and try to get as many games as they can. And as you can see in a World Cup, the group stage matches, there's a lot of excitement there. That's where you get a lot of tourism from around the world because, a country from Africa, an Asian country, and a South American country can land in your city in the same group. And so that brings a lot of tourism. There's a lot of excitement early. Once the group stage and the knockout stage begins, fans leave. The knockout stage begins. Teams that are eliminated, those fans might leave. Some of the journalists leave. So, I think you want to get as much as you can early. And my sense is that Atlanta will certainly do that. Yes, semifinals and finals are big moments for cities, but Atlanta has everything in their power. And you mentioned the media center. I was there again, very localized in that there was one main international broadcast center and one main media center in Doha. It was wonderful to see. And I think Atlanta, in speaking to sources, knowing that is something important to them, it could be a big benefit to the city. You have essentially journalists from around the world coming here and setting up shop in your city. It'll be valuable for international press, for FIFA as well. Perhaps there are some pros and cons to that, but in the end, you're once again showing what you can do at an international scale, if that's possible.
Well, speaking of pros and cons, as we've seen with this World Cup, the certainly Western media devoted plenty of coverage to covering issues unrelated to soccer itself. They really, we might just say, aired Qatar's social, economic, political dirty laundry. Is having the World Cup in Atlanta a double-edged sword?
I mean, I think at any tournament, and this goes for March Madness, for instance, any city that hosts a big time tournament that's going to draw fans from around the country, around the world, you're opening yourself up to scrutiny. All the reporting that took place before the World Cup started on human rights, on the fact that LGBTQ communities in the region, especially in Qatar, were being persecuted, that was very real. Those were reports that we were getting from around the world, with legitimate sources. And yes, the Emir of Qatar, I was in the country when he said that there had been sort of a campaign against the country, in sort of those sorts of reports. But when you witness it, and so many of my colleagues had, you understand that those are factual. Now, yeah, I'll tell you one thing. For instance, in my experience, having spent 23 days in Qatar, I went to 14 games in 14 days. It was nonstop. After my initial culture shock, because it was true, like I was not sure where I was. I didn't know how to get to where I needed to be. Ultimately, I felt like the people were very friendly. I felt safe. Like petty crime was not something that I had to even think about. I would get to the hotel around 4 or 5 a.m. sometimes and just walk around and go grab a bite to eat. Obviously I'm a Western journalist, and everyone knew that, and so I was treated differently. But in a city like Atlanta, a city like Los Angeles, Chicago was not bidding, but Kansas City, Miami, where there are issues of security, that's going to be a big thing. I noticed, and in speaking to people around just the Atlanta bid and just being in Qatar, security is like one of the probably the biggest issue for fans, for teams, even for those delegations. And so that's something that Atlanta, as an example, will have to shore up. And those are the things that when you invite international press, they will find some of those issues and report on them.
Unfortunately, and we do have a question on that topic from Anna Petrova, who says sports are often deemed as public diplomacy efforts by governments. She asks, do you think we'll see an uptick in major sporting events being hosted in countries that don't always align with US values? And from your perspective, can this soft diplomacy actually achieve any?
That's a wonderful question. It really is. And it was a big topic during the World Cup, because I'll give you an example. Not only were we at a World Cup in the Middle East, in a country that doesn't have a football in history. There is a league there, and it is essentially a lot of players go there to retire, if you will. But Saudi Arabia is bidding for 2030. And we obviously understand the political situation in Saudi Arabia, the relationship with the United States, the fact that there have been state-sponsored killings of a journalist and of citizens in Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of repression there as well, very similar to what we noticed in Qatar. But they're going for it. They're going to go for that 2030 World Cup. They have actually signed Leo Messi as an ambassador of their tourism company in Saudi Arabia. So I think from what we can glean from Gianni Infantino, the FIFA president, part of his mission is to spread these types of tournaments around the country where they haven't been held before. 2010 in South Africa was the first instance of FIFA doing that. It was largely a success and widely accepted for Africa to have their first World Cup. But when you're entering perhaps political situations, with Russia included in 2018, in hindsight, that are highly controversial, that's going to be something that is well discussed. And to answer the question, yes, I do believe that that's going to be something that the West is going to have to contend with. South America wanting to bid for also a joint World Cup in 2030 between Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, and Paraguay. They're going to be up against it with Saudi Arabia. Europe has a bid as well. Spain, I think Ukraine is getting in on a joint bid as well. So speaking of countries that perhaps are in that situation, Spain has aligned with, I think, Spain, Portugal, Ukraine in hosting 2030. So yes, it's an excellent question because it's going to be top of mind moving forward.
Really interesting that we're this move toward regional World Cups.
Yes.
That sort of spreads the burden and the responsibility, but also as Anna put it, the sort of soft sports diplomacy.
Correct. Does it help to end the question?
Yeah.
Does it help? That is highly debatable because, as we know, there's the the issue of sports washing, of what does that mean, and what are the consequences of playing into that. Obviously from FIFA and from Qatar, they're saying that this World Cup will bring that region closer to the West, and open up the country and the culture to people that hadn't experienced it before. And I'm sure if you speak to fans that are there, they might say, yes, like it was a wonderful experience. What happens when the World Cup leaves that country, though? And the people that are there, the citizens that are still there, that's the big concern for reporters on the ground.
Great. We have a dual question. Speaking of reporters on the ground, Francisco asks, what are your thoughts on Fox's coverage of the current World Cup? For those of you who may not be following, Fox has been receiving some Twitter shade for their coverage. But Francisco asks how they have blatantly ignored all underlying issues leading up to the tournament. I think that it's a two-part criticism. Sure. I think Fox's coverage just of sports coverage is pretty limited. Mm-hmm. And then we've got all the off sports issues as well. So I'll invite you to comment on that.
Sure. Well, first of all, caveat, I haven't been in Qatar. Like, I didn't see Fox's coverage. I read about it. I heard about it. Okay. I'm very aware of it. And now, since having been back a week, I've tapped into it to try to understand what the feedback has been. I agree with you, Ricky. And I think this is just part of the approach that Fox has to major sporting events. They want to attract as many people as possible, go as mainstream as possible, bring new fans that may watch the sport once every 4 years. So that conflicts with the hardcore fan. And as a writer for The Athletic, like that is our audience. Like we write to anyone, but honestly, the hardcore fan, the heavily invested fan, the educated fan that wants to be tested, that wants to feel that they're not being talked down to, those are the fans that I understand feel left out, that have not connected with Fox's coverage. There's the studio teams that have been heavily criticized, and how the approach to studio coverage has been, having someone like Chad Ochocinco, who's a former NFL wide receiver, a big soccer fan, but what is he truly contributing to a studio broadcast during a World Cup? I think fans are wanting more. They're used to seeing like the Champions League coverage in Europe. I know that the concept behind studio coverage is changing, honestly. If you look at how CBS does their Champions League coverage, they're covering one of the biggest sporting events in Europe and in the world, but there is a very casualness to how the talent comes off. So that, I think that's just rubbing people the wrong way. Now, the second part of the question, and how they've ignored the issues of a World Cup, I think is a bigger concern. And the Washington Post published a story while I was there about which in their reporting, the journalist reported that Fox was actually, their coverage was sponsored by the Qatari government. They took money from the Qatari government, which may explain why they aren't going, all in on some of the social issues. But you look at Telemundo, Universo, that's the Universal and Telemundo, that's the Spanish language side. They have come out right away and said, we're going to cover both the on the field and off the field issues. It hasn't been a constant part of the coverage, but they haven't ignored it. I think that was welcomed. And I think Fox this is going to be something that they have to address after the World Cup. And this is something they have the next World Cup as well. And they have the European Championships in 2024. So if this is what fans are going to be served, I think they'll have to address it and try to find middle ground for sure. It wasn't a great look, to be honest with you, to having ignored some of those issues.
And also just the in-studio, you're right. You don't ever want to be talked down to, it's not a parade.
Right.
It's not just like, la, 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 this is happening and cut away to fans. And I mean, it's, anyway, so I think Fox could benefit from having just more variety. Give me more options. I can go higher, I can go low, but to just have more diversity of options for the television consumer of the World Cup coverage.
I would say diversity of thought as well, Ricky, to your point. Yes. Like it's like, I know a lot of those professionals that are on the studio. I know they work hard and they've been part of the culture of American soccer for so long, but I think if you look at what Telemundo has done, they've brought analysts from around the world, some former players from different countries, referees from around the world. I think it's a little, they have a few women calling games and female analysts as well. You saw the diversity there. And I think people are wanting to see, well, it's just the same group that calls MLS games. Now they're calling a World Cup games with the same studio team. And that, to your point, maybe this is the biggest tournament in the world. Maybe try to mix it up and give the fans that diversity of thought.
Well, great. Well, we have a question from Ralph Herrera who wants to know your prediction, best case number of games Atlanta could host and worst case.
Best case is probably 6. I think I remember in speaking to people close to the bid, I'm pretty sure this was now months ago, but I think I remember hearing that number, 6 games, which would be amazing, would be incredible for Atlanta. And I think that would total first round and knockout round. Worst case, I think worst case is just getting, a semifinal and a quarterfinal. Like those are big games. Those are incredibly important games. But as a host city, I think you want to maximize your resources and your facilities.
Like you said, the early stage, I mean, anything can happen stages. And that's what's so exciting is
right.
All the Cinderella stories, all the upsets. That's where they start, and to have all the fans here in Atlanta would be great.
Right.
Well, we will be continuing to bring you programming on the World Cup over the next 4 years, certainly, I promise. And I know Felipe will. Felipe Cardenas, staff writer, Cardenas, of The Athletic. Thank you for joining us. Why don't you give us a preview of an interesting story that you have coming up that we should be looking for?
Well, I would invite everyone, if you haven't subscribed for The Athletic, do so. If you're a subscriber, thank you so much. I think this tournament has proven that we have both a UK team and a North American team that has been on the ground. We had over 17 people in Qatar covering the tournament, and our content, I think, has delivered. So leading up to the final, go to The Athletic. We have a lot of stories that are talking about this big final, Messi's last chance really to win that tournament. And I have a story coming out tomorrow on one of the most controversial goals of all time, the Hand of God goal, the origin of that goal between Argentina and England. That was a very geopolitically tense game as well. It was just 4 years removed from the Falkland Wars, the war in the Falkland Islands. And then I'm going to write about Leo Messi as well, and what his legacy is if he wins or if he doesn't win, where does he stand in Argentina, a soccer mad country like Argentina.
Is Atlanta United's own Thiago Almada going to be playing on Sunday? Do we know?
I doubt it. I mean, a funny story, if you didn't see on Twitter, I saw him in the mix zone of a game, and he was very surprised to see me. Yeah.
His Atlanta United reporter.
Exactly. And we sort of shook hands quickly and just, I said, good luck or whatever. He's a young player, and he's played 6 minutes. He got in during the win against Poland. I've been at Argentina games, and he's not part of the group that even warms up when they're getting the subs ready. But in an emergency situation, I think he could potentially see time. If Argentina needs the skill set that he provides, which is close to goal and attacking and sort of the unpredictable creative player, then maybe yes. But you never know. We've seen crazier things happen at this tournament.
Well, we'll be watching for an Atlanta United player maybe playing on Sunday in the final of the World Cup with Argentina. Thank you so much, Felipe. And thanks to our audience for joining us. Please mark your calendar for January 18th for another in-depth virtual conversation. I will be interviewing the author of The Globalization Myth, Shannon O'Neill. She'll be talking about the winners and losers of globalization and actually her advice for the U.S. shifting its strategy on international trade. And the World Affairs Council of Atlanta can bring you all sorts of interesting conversations like this with your support. To learn more about individual or corporate membership, come to our website, wacatlanta.org. That is also where you can subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date on programs. Thanks to our audience. Thank you to Felipe. Until next time, happy holidays.